The medical bay of the captured human vessel hummed with the soft sound of life support systems. Commander Zethkar of the Vorthik Empire lay on a makeshift bed, his blue blood slowly pooling beneath his broken body. His 4 eyes, once sharp and commanding, now dimmed with the approach of death. The alien warrior's breathing came in short, painful gasps as he struggled to form words in the human tongue. He had learned during his years of military service. Lieutenant Amy Thompson moved carefully around the dying alien, her medical training taking over despite the strange anatomy before her. She had never treated a Vorthek before, but wounds were wounds, and she did what she could to ease his suffering. Her hands worked quickly, applying pressure to the worst injuries while monitoring his vital signs on equipment hastily adapted for alien physiology. Standing nearby, Commander Jake Morrison held a recording device, his weathered face showing no emotion as he watched the enemy soldier who had once led attacks against human colonies. Morrison had seen too much war to feel hatred for a dying opponent, but he also knew the value of intelligence. Every word this alien spoke could save human lives in future conflicts. "You must understand," Zethkar whispered, his voice barely audible above the medical equipment, "what your species truly is. My people made a terrible mistake when we first encountered you." He paused, struggling to find the right words in the human language. "We thought you were weak, primitive creatures clinging to a single world. We were wrong about everything." The alien's breathing grew more labored, but his eyes remained focused on Morrison. "I need to tell you what happened, what we learned about humans in war. Perhaps it will help you understand why the Vorthik Empire now fears your kind more than any force in the galaxy." Morrison nodded silently, adjusting the recording device to capture every word. Amy continued her work, knowing that keeping the alien alive long enough to share his story might be more important than any medical procedure she had ever performed. 3 years ago, Zethkar continued, our scout ships first detected your world. Earth seemed so small, so insignificant compared to the vast territories of our empire. We had conquered 17 star systems by then, each one falling before our military might with barely a fight. The High Command viewed humans as another primitive species that would submit or be destroyed. The alien's 4 eyes closed briefly, and Amy feared they had lost him. But then he opened them again, driven by some internal need to complete his testimony. "Our intelligence reports showed that humans had barely left their home system. Your technology was centuries behind ours. Your weapons were crude projectile devices compared to our energy cannons. Your ships moved slowly through space while ours could cross star systems in days. Admiral Kreshtal was chosen to lead the first expedition to your world," Zethkar said, his voice growing stronger as he remembered his former commander. "He was the most decorated officer in the Empire, a warrior who had personally overseen the conquest of 7 worlds. The admiral laughed when he saw the human fleet positions. 200 of our finest warships against perhaps 20 of your crude vessels." Amy finished applying a bandage to one of the alien's wounds, noting that his vital signs were stabilizing slightly. The medical treatment was buying them time, but not much. She caught Morrison's eye and shook her head slightly. The commander understood. They had perhaps an hour before the alien's injuries claimed him. "I was serving as tactical officer aboard the Admiral's flagship," Zethkar continued. "My job was to analyze enemy formations and recommend attack strategies. When we arrived at the edge of your solar system, I expected to see the same thing we had encountered on every other world. Ships fleeing in panic, desperate communications begging for mercy. Perhaps a few brave fools making meaningless gestures of defiance before accepting defeat." The alien's breathing hitched and he coughed, bringing up more blue blood. Amy quickly cleaned it away, allowing him to continue. "But what we found was different. Your ships held formation even as our fleet approached. There was no panic in your communications, no pleas for mercy. Instead, we intercepted transmissions between your vessels that spoke of tactics, of weapon targeting, of something called honor and death. The human fleet was commanded by Captain Rick Davis aboard your Earth defense ship Valor," Zethkar said, his voice taking on a tone of grudging respect. "We monitored his communications to his fleet, expecting to hear fear or desperation." Instead, we heard him telling his crews to make every shot count, to show these invaders what humans were made of. He spoke of protecting Earth not just as a military objective, but as a sacred duty. Morrison leaned closer, recognizing the name. Captain Davis had become a legend among human forces, though few knew the full details of his final battle. "What happened during the engagement?" he asked quietly. "That," Zethkar replied, "was when we should have realized we were facing something entirely different from any species we had encountered before. Something that would change the course of the war and ultimately save the galaxy from our empire's expansion." The alien's eyes began to close again, but his voice remained steady. "What happened next should have been a warning to all Vorthic forces. But we were too confident, too certain of our superiority to recognize the trap we were walking into." Zethkar's eyes focused on the ceiling of the medical bay as memories of that first battle flooded back. Amy Thompson continued monitoring his vital signs while Commander Morrison waited patiently for the alien to continue his story. The dying Vorthic warrior seemed to gather strength from somewhere deep within, driven by an urgent need to share what he had witnessed. "The day our fleet arrived at Earth's edge will forever be burned into my memory," Zethkar said, his voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. "Admiral Kreshtal ordered our ships into attack formation, confident that this would be another easy victory. Our intelligence had told us that humans were a young species, barely capable of space travel. We expected them to surrender at the first sight of our overwhelming force." The alien paused, coughing slightly before continuing. "But as we approached your defensive positions, something felt wrong. The human ships did not scatter or retreat as expected. Instead, they moved into what appeared to be a suicide formation. Captain Rick Davis positioned his small fleet directly between our massive force and Earth, knowing that his ships could not possibly survive such an encounter." Morrison leaned forward, remembering the stories he had heard about Davis and his crew. The official reports had been classified, but rumors of their final battle had spread throughout the human fleet. "What did you observe during the engagement?" he asked. "The battle began exactly as our tactical computers predicted," Zethkar replied. "Our energy weapons tore through your ship hulls like they were made of paper. Your primitive projectile weapons barely scratched our shields. Within the first 10 minutes, half of your fleet was destroyed or crippled. Any rational species would have surrendered at that point." Amy noticed that the alien's breathing had become more steady as he spoke, as if sharing this story was somehow keeping him alive. She adjusted his foredrip and checked his bandages, buying them more time to hear his testimony. "But humans are not rational in the way other species understand the concept," Zethkar continued. "Instead of surrendering, Captain Davis ordered his remaining ships to close distance with our fleet. He broadcast a message to all human vessels that we intercepted and translated. He said that if they were going to die, they would take as many Vorthak with them as possible." The alien's 4 eyes dimmed slightly as he recalled the horror of what happened next. "Your captain ordered his ships to ram our vessels. Not as a last desperate act, but as a deliberate tactical decision. The first human ship to reach our formation was a small destroyer commanded by Lieutenant Kate Wilson. She aimed her ship directly at one of our cruisers and detonated her engines at the moment of impact. The explosion was unlike anything we had ever seen," Zethkar said, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and admiration. "The human ship was completely destroyed, but it took our cruiser with it. The shockwave damaged 2 other Vorthic vessels. Our tactical computers had never calculated for such an attack because no species had ever used deliberate suicide as a standard military tactic." Morrison felt a chill as he listened to the alien's account. The human military had always known that desperation could drive soldiers to extraordinary acts, but to hear it described from the enemy's perspective gave it a different meaning. "Captain Davis himself led the final assault," Zethkar continued. "His ship, the Valor, was heavily damaged but still functional. He could have retreated, could have lived to fight another day. Instead, he broadcast one final message that our communications officers translated and reported to Admiral Kreshtal." The alien's voice grew quieter, almost reverent. "Davis said, 'Tell your emperor we're just getting started. This is what happens when you threaten our home. Remember this day, because it's the last easy victory you'll ever have." Then he aimed his ship at our flagship. Amy watched the alien's vital signs spike as he relived the memory. His alien physiology was responding to the stress of recalling the traumatic event, but she could see that he was determined to finish his story. "The Valor's reactor was damaged and unstable," Zethkar said. "Any competent engineer would have ejected it to prevent a catastrophic explosion. Instead, Captain Davis overloaded the reactor deliberately. When his ship struck our flagship, the explosion was so powerful it created a temporary star in the void of space." The alien closed his eyes, and for a moment Morrison thought he had lost consciousness. But then Zethkar spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Admiral Kestrel survived, but 3 of our finest cruisers were destroyed in that single act. The blast damaged a dozen more vessels. In one moment, your primitive captain had inflicted more damage on our fleet than entire planetary defense forces had managed in previous conquests." "What was the fleet's response?" Morrison asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "We retreated," Zethkar admitted, shame evident in his voice. "Not because we were defeated, but because we were confused. We had never encountered a species that chose mutual destruction over tactical withdrawal. The Admiral needed time to analyze what had happened, to understand what kind of enemy we were truly facing." The alien's breathing grew more labored again, but his eyes remained focused on Morrison. "That should have been our warning. That should have been the moment we realized humans were unlike any species in the galaxy. But we were too proud, too confident in our superiority to recognize the truth." "What truth?" Morrison asked. "That humans don't just fight wars," Zethkar replied. "You perfect them." The alien's breathing steadied as he prepared to continue his testimony. Amy Thompson checked his vital signs once more, noting that somehow his condition had stabilized despite the severity of his injuries. Commander Morrison adjusted the recording device, sensing that the next part of Zethkar's story would be crucial to understanding how the war had developed. "After our retreat from Earth's solar system, Admiral Kestrel ordered a full intelligence review of the human species," Zethkar said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "What we discovered in the following weeks changed everything we thought we knew about warfare itself. The humans began to transform before our very eyes, and we watched in growing horror as they prepared for our return." The alien paused, his 4 eyes focusing on Morrison with an intensity that made the human commander uncomfortable. "Within days of our first battle, your entire species mobilized for war. Not just your military forces, but your entire civilization. We monitored your communications and witnessed something we had never seen before in any conquered species. Lieutenant Colonel Steve Parker appeared on every human communication channel," Zethkar continued. "He was your new military coordinator, a man who seemed to be everywhere at once. He spoke to your people not with fear or desperation, but with excitement. He told them that finally, after centuries of fighting only each other, humans had found a worthy enemy." Amy noticed that the alien's voice carried a tone of genuine bewilderment as he described human behavior. His species clearly struggled to understand the human response to the threat of invasion. "Your civilian population began converting their ships into weapons of war," Zethkar said. "Cargo haulers were fitted with missile launchers. Passenger liners were turned into troop transports. Mining vessels became mobile gun platforms. Every human with technical knowledge worked day and night to prepare for our return." The alien's breathing grew more rapid as he recalled the intelligence reports that had flooded in during those weeks. "But it was not just the military preparations that disturbed us. It was the psychological warfare your species began to broadcast into space. Dr. Helen Martinez, your chief scientist who studied alien biology, began transmitting detailed analyses of Vorthic weaknesses directly to our fleet." Morrison felt a surge of pride at the mention of Dr. Martinez. Her broadcasts had become legendary among human forces, though he had never heard them described from the enemy perspective. She spoke in perfect Vorthic language, describing every vulnerability in our anatomy, every weakness in our technology, Zethkar continued. But worse than her scientific analysis were the cultural transmissions that followed. Your species began broadcasting what you called songs of war, stories, of your previous conflicts and promises of what awaited us when we returned. The alien's eyes closed briefly, as if the memory was too painful to witness. We learned about places called Stalingrad, where your people fought in frozen ruins until the very end. We heard about Thermopylae, where a few hundred warriors held back an entire army. We discovered Gettysburg, where your ancestors killed each other by the thousands over ideas and principles. Our intelligence officers tried to explain to the High Command what these historical references meant, Zethkar said. They were not just battles to your people. They were sacred memories that defined human identity. Every human child learned these stories, studied the tactics, and dreamed of adding their own names to the list of heroes. Amy watched the alien's vital signs spike again as he became more agitated. His species clearly found human military culture deeply disturbing on a fundamental level. The most terrifying transmission came from a human child, Zethkar continued. A boy named Bobby Chun, perhaps 10 years old by your standards. He sent a message directly to Admiral Kreshtal, speaking in broken but understandable Vorthak language. The child said that his school class had been studying our first battle, and they had identified 17 tactical errors our admiral had made. Morrison tried to hide his amazement. Human children analyzing alien military tactics was not something he had expected to hear about, but it perfectly captured the human approach to warfare. The boy's message continued, Zethkar said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. He said that his class had developed 12 different strategies for defeating our fleet, and that they had sent these plans to your military commanders. A human child, barely old enough to understand basic mathematics, was teaching your generals how to fight us more effectively. The alien coughed, bringing up more blue blood, but pushed on with his story. Our psychologists studied these transmissions and reported something that shocked the entire empire. Humans did not just prepare for war, they celebrated it. They found joy in the challenge, excitement in the danger, and meaning in the sacrifice. Other species fought because they had to, Zethkar continued. They defended their worlds out of necessity, surrendered when defeat became inevitable, and accepted conquest as a natural part of existence. But humans seem to view war as the ultimate test of their abilities, the highest expression of their nature. Amy noticed that the alien's speech was becoming more fluent as he spoke, as if discussing human warfare was somehow familiar and comfortable to him despite his injuries. We monitored your military academies and discovered that you studied every conflict in your history, analyzing victories and defeats with equal intensity, Zethkar said. Your generals read ancient texts about battles fought with swords and spears, applying those lessons to modern space combat. You learned from every enemy you had ever faced, including each other. The alien's eyes opened wide as he reached the most disturbing part of his testimony. But what truly terrified our leadership was the discovery that humans had been preparing for this moment for centuries. Every war you had ever fought, every weapon you had ever developed, every tactic you had ever used was practice for the day you would face an enemy from the stars. Morrison felt a chill as he realized the implications of what the alien was saying. Humanity's violent history was not a weakness to be overcome, but a strength that had been developing for millennia. When Admiral Kreshtal received all these intelligence reports, Zethkar concluded, he made a decision that would doom our second assault. He decided that overwhelming force was the answer, that sheer numbers would crush human resistance before they could implement their elaborate plans? The alien's breathing grew labored again, but his eyes remained focused on Morrison. He was wrong about that too. Zethkar's voice took on a darker tone as he prepared to describe the Vorthak Empire's second attempt at conquest. Amy Thompson noticed that his vital signs had stabilized again, as if the act of sharing his testimony was somehow sustaining him. Commander Morrison remained silent, letting the alien continue his story at his own pace. 6 months after our first encounter, Admiral Kreshtal assembled the largest invasion force in Vorthak history, Zethkar said, his 4 eyes reflecting. the memory of that massive fleet. 500 warships, including our most powerful dreadnoughts and battle cruisers. The admiral was convinced that overwhelming numbers would crush human resistance before they could implement their strange tactics. The alien paused, gathering strength for what was clearly a painful memory. The target was Mars, your second-largest colony world. Our intelligence indicated it was defended by only 30,000 human troops under the command of General Lisa Rodriguez. The admiral believed that capturing Mars would demonstrate Vortex superiority and force Earth to surrender. Morrison felt his jaw tighten at the mention of Mars. The battle for that world had become a turning point in human military thinking, though the full details had been classified at the highest levels. Few people knew what had really happened there. As we approached the Red Planet, everything seemed to proceed according to plan, Sethkar continued. Our advanced scouts reported that human defenses were lighter than expected. The orbital defense platforms were outdated and the surface installations appeared hastily constructed. Admiral Kreshtal was pleased, believing that humans had been unable to properly fortify their colony in the time since our first battle. The alien's breathing grew more rapid as he recalled the initial phases of the assault. The space battle was brief and decisive. Our fleet easily overwhelmed the human ships defending Mars. Major Tom Sullivan commanded the Planetary Defense Force, and his Marines fought bravely but were clearly outmatched. Within hours, we had achieved orbital supremacy and begun landing. Our ground forces. Amy watched the alien's vital signs carefully, noting that his stress levels were increasing as he approached the most traumatic part of his story. She made small adjustments to his medical support systems, ensuring he could continue speaking. The ground assault began perfectly, Sethkar said, his voice growing quieter. Our troops landed at strategic points around the planet, securing spaceports and communication facilities. The human defenders retreated quickly, abandoning positions that should have been defended to the death. Major Sullivan's forces fell back from the main spaceport without putting up the fierce resistance we had expected. The alien's eyes closed tightly, and Morrison could see that he was struggling with the memory. At first, we thought the humans had learned wisdom from their defeat in space. Their retreat seemed tactical, preserving their forces for a final defense around the colonial capital. Admiral Kreshtal was pleased that the conquest would be swift and with minimal losses. But something felt wrong, Sethkar continued, opening his eyes to look directly at Morrison. The human retreat was too organized, too deliberate. They abandoned valuable equipment and supplies, but took time to disable systems in ways that seemed unnecessary. Our intelligence officers reported that the humans were destroying their own infrastructure, but not in the panicked way of a defeated army. The alien's voice grew stronger as he reached the crucial part of his testimony. It was Engineer Chief Carol Stevens who provided the answer to our confusion. We intercepted her communications to the retreating human forces, and our translators worked frantically to decode her messages. She was not coordinating a retreat. She was preparing to spring a trap. Morrison leaned forward, knowing that this was the moment when everything had changed. The Mars operation had redefined human military doctrine and terrified every alien species that learned about it. We discovered that the humans had spent months preparing Mars not as a fortress to be defended, but as a weapon to be used against us, Sethkar said, his voice filled with a mixture of horror and admiration. Every building we had occupied was rigged with explosives. Every tunnel we used for cover had been turned into a death trap. The entire planet had been converted into a massive killing field. The alien's breathing became labored as he recalled the moment of realization, but the explosives were not the worst part. The humans had been working on something far more terrible. They had calculated the exact amount of force needed to destabilize the polar ice caps, and Engineer Stevens had placed charges at precise locations to achieve maximum effect. Amy noticed that the alien's vital signs were spiking again, but she could see that he was determined to finish this part of his story. His species clearly found the human strategy deeply disturbing on a fundamental level. When our forces were fully committed to the surface, Spread across the planet in what we thought was a successful occupation, Carol Stevens sent a single coded transmission to her remaining forces, Zethkar continued. The message was simple: welcome to Mars, population 0, then she detonated the charges. The alien's 4 eyes widened as he relived the catastrophic moment. The polar ice caps collapsed simultaneously, sending billions of tons of water rushing toward the equatorial regions where most of our troops were positioned. But this was not a natural disaster. It was a carefully planned geological weapon designed to maximum casualties among invading forces. The floodwaters were not the only danger, Zethkar said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. The humans had mixed industrial chemicals into the water supply, creating a toxic soup that dissolved our equipment and poisoned our soldiers. What should have been a simple flood became a chemical warfare attack on a planetary scale. Morrison felt sick as he listened to the alien's description. The tactical brilliance of the Mars operation was undeniable, but the human cost had been enormous. Every colonist on the planet had known they were volunteering for a suicide mission. Nearly half our invasion force died in the first hour after. The charges were detonated, Zethkar continued. Those who survived found themselves trapped on a world that had become uninhabitable. The humans had poisoned their own planet to deny it to us, sacrificing an entire colony to inflict maximum damage on our forces. The alien's breathing grew more steady as he concluded this part of his testimony. Admiral Crushtoll achieved his objective. We captured Mars and claimed it for the Empire. But the victory was meaningless. The planet was now a toxic wasteland, and the cost in Vorthic lives had been catastrophic. But the tactical defeat was not the worst part, Zethkar said, his eyes focusing on Morrison with terrible intensity. The worst part was what we learned about the human defenders. Every single person on Mars had been a volunteer. They had all known the plan, accepted their fate, and chosen to die in order to hurt us as much as possible. The alien's voice grew quiet again as he prepared to deliver the most disturbing revelation. General Rodriguez's final message to Earth was not a cry for help or a request for rescue. It was a detailed after-action report on enemy casualties and tactical recommendations for the next battle. She died analyzing our weaknesses even as her world burned around her. Morrison felt a chill as he realized the full implications of what the alien was telling him. Mars had not been a desperate last stand. It had been a carefully planned sacrifice designed to gather intelligence and inflict maximum psychological damage on the enemy. That, Zethkar concluded, was when the Vorthic Empire began to understand what kind of species we were truly fighting. The silence in the medical bay stretched for several moments as Zethkar gathered his remaining strength. Amy Thompson watched his vital signs carefully, noting that his condition was deteriorating despite her best efforts. Commander Morrison remained patient, understanding that what the alien was about to tell them might be the most important part of his testimony. The aftermath of Mars changed everything for the Vorthic Empire, Zethkar said, his voice weaker but still determined. We had achieved a technical victory, but at a cost that shook our entire military command structure. Nearly 200,000 of our finest soldiers were dead, and Mars was now a poisoned wasteland that served no strategic purpose. The alien paused, his 4 eyes reflecting the pain of those memories. But the physical losses were nothing compared to the psychological impact on our forces. Our soldiers had expected to face an enemy that would fight and then surrender when defeat became inevitable. Instead, they found themselves battling a species that seemed to prefer mutual destruction over any form of defeat. Amy noticed that the alien's speech was becoming more labored, but his determination to complete his story remained strong. She made small adjustments to his medical support, buying them more time to hear his testimony. The reports from Mars survivors haunted our entire fleet, Zethkar continued. They spoke of human defenders who sang while they died, who laughed as they detonated explosives that killed them along with our soldiers. Commander Betty Walsh, the last surviving human officer on Mars, spent her final moments not asking for rescue but transmitting tactical data about our weapons and armor weaknesses. Morrison felt his chest tighten as he listened to the alien's description. The official reports had mentioned Walsh's final transmission, but hearing it described from the enemy perspective gave it a different weight. Our intelligence officers analyzed every aspect of the Mars operation, Zethkar said, his breathing growing more shallow. What they discovered terrified the High Command more than any weapon or technology. The humans had not just planned to destroy Mars as a desperate last resort. They had designed the entire colony from the beginning as a potential weapon against invaders. The alien's eyes closed briefly, and Morrison thought they might lose him. But then Zethkar opened them again, driven by an urgent need to share what he had learned. Every building, every tunnel, every piece of infrastructure on Mars had been constructed with hidden demolition charges, he continued. The human colonists had lived for years knowing that their homes were essentially elaborate traps waiting to be sprung. They raised their children, built their lives, and pursued their dreams on a world that was designed to become their tomb. And they watched the alien's vital signs spike as he became more agitated. His species clearly found the human approach to warfare deeply disturbing on a psychological level. But what truly shocked our leadership was the discovery that Mars was not unique, Zethkar said, his voice growing stronger with urgency. Our long-range scouts reported similar preparations on every human world. Jupiter's moons were being converted into massive weapons platforms. Venus was being terraformed not for colonization, but as a chemical weapons production facility. The alien's breathing became more rapid as he recalled the intelligence reports that had flooded into the Vorthak fleet. Earth itself was being transformed into the ultimate fortress. Your people had evacuated entire cities and rebuilt them as massive fortifications. Children were being trained in military tactics alongside reading and mathematics. Elderly civilians were learning to use weapons and explosives. Morrison felt a chill as he realized the scope of human preparation. The war had changed humanity itself, turning an entire species into a military force unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Our psychologists studied human behavior patterns and made a report that reached the Emperor himself, Zethkar continued. They concluded that humans had evolved specifically for warfare, that your entire species was designed by nature to excel at organized violence. They recommended immediate withdrawal from human space before the situation became even more dangerous. The alien's voice grew quieter as he recalled the debates within Vorthak leadership. But Admiral Kreshtal argued that retreat would show weakness to other species in the galaxy. He believed that one final assault with overwhelming force would break human resistance and restore Vorthak prestige. The Emperor agreed to one last campaign. Amy noticed that the alien's vital signs were becoming more erratic, but she could see that he was determined to finish this part of his story. His breathing was shallow but steady as he continued. The third assault was planned as the ultimate demonstration of Vorthak military power, Zethkar said. 1,000 warships, including our most powerful dreadnoughts and planet-killer weapons. The target was Earth itself, with the intention of ending human resistance through the complete destruction of your home world. The alien's eyes focused on Morrison with terrible intensity. But by then, something had changed in the human military command structure. Admiral Johnson had taken control of your space forces, and he was implementing strategies that our intelligence officers could barely comprehend. Morrison recognized the name. Admiral Johnson had become a legend among human forces, though his methods were sometimes considered extreme even by human standards. Johnson's response to our fleet buildup was not to prepare defensive positions around Earth, Zethkar continued. Instead, he began what he called a preemptive strike campaign. Human forces started attacking Vorthak supply lines, communication networks, and staging areas throughout our territory. The alien's breathing grew more labored, but his voice remained clear. Your admiral understood something that our leadership had missed. Humans do not fight defensive wars. When threatened, they attack. When outnumbered, they become more aggressive. When facing extinction, they seek to take as many enemies with them as possible. Amy watched the alien's vital signs carefully, noting that his condition was deteriorating rapidly. She caught Morrison's eye and nodded slightly. They were running. Out of time. The human raids were unlike anything we had experienced, Zethkar said, his voice growing weaker. Your forces did not target our military installations. They attacked our civilian infrastructure, our industrial facilities, our population centers. They were not trying to win battles. They were trying to make the cost of fighting humans, too, high for any species to bear. The alien's eyes began to close, but he forced them open again. Admiral Johnson's final message to our fleet was broadcast on all frequencies. He said that if we wanted to destroy humanity, we would have to sacrifice every Vorthak in the galaxy to do it. He promised that for every human who died, 10 aliens would follow. Morrison leaned closer, sensing that the alien was reaching the climax of his testimony. What happened to the third assault? He asked quietly. That, Zethkar whispered, is when the Vorthak Empire learned the most important lesson about warfare. Sometimes victory costs more than defeat. Zethkar's breathing had become shallow and irregular, but his eyes remained focused on Commander Morrison with fierce determination. Amy Thompson checked his vital signs one final time, knowing that the alien's life was measured in minutes rather than hours. The dying Vorthak warrior seemed to draw strength from some deep reserve, driven by an urgent need to complete his warning. The third assault never happened, Zethkar whispered, his voice barely audible above the medical equipment. Admiral, Johnson's preemptive strikes had achieved something no military strategist in Vorthak history had ever conceived possible. He had made the Empire afraid of a species that possessed inferior technology and smaller numbers. The alien paused, struggling to form words as his body began to fail. Your admiral understood the fundamental truth about warfare that we had missed. Victory is not about destroying your enemy. It is about making your enemy unwilling to continue. Fighting, Johnson made the cost of conquering humanity too high for any rational species to pay. Morrison leaned closer, recognizing that these might be the alien's final words. The recording device continued to capture every sound, preserving testimony that might change human understanding of their place in the galaxy. The human raids targeted not just our military installations, but our entire way of life, Zethkar continued, his 4 eyes dimming but still focused. Your forces attacked our supply convoys, destroyed our communication networks, and struck at civilian targets across 17 star systems, but it was not random destruction. Every attack was calculated to cause maximum psychological damage to our population. Amy noticed that the alien's vital signs were fluctuating wildly, but somehow he continued speaking. His species' physiology seemed to be sustaining him through sheer willpower. Johnson's forces captured one of our major supply depots and found detailed intelligence about Vorthak civilian populations, Zethkar said, his voice growing stronger with urgency. Instead of using this information to target our families, he broadcast it back to our home worlds. Every Vorthak civilian received detailed reports about human military capabilities, casualty rates from previous battles, and projections for future conflicts. The alien's breathing hitched, and he coughed up more blue blood. The message was clear. If the Empire continued its assault on humanity, every Vorthak world would become a battlefield. Your admiral was not threatening our military. He was promising to bring total war to our entire civilization. Morrison felt a chill as he realized the implications of what the alien was describing. Admiral Johnson had not just been defending humanity. He had been conducting psychological warfare on a galactic scale. But the most terrifying part of Johnson's strategy was not the threats he made, Zethkar continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. It was the promises he kept. When our leadership ignored his warnings and continued preparing for the assault on Earth, he demonstrated exactly what total war meant. The alien's eyes closed briefly, and Morrison thought they had lost him. But then Zethkar opened them again, driven by a desperate need to share his final warning. Johnson's fleet appeared at our colony world of Kethmer without warning, he said, his voice gaining strength from the memory. But instead of attacking military targets, He broadcast a message to the civilian population. He told them that they had 1 hour to evacuate the planet before he turned it into a demonstration of human military capabilities. Amy watched the alien's vital signs spike as he recalled the traumatic event. His species clearly found the human approach to warfare deeply disturbing on every level. Most of our people thought it was a bluff, Zethkar continued. How could a species with primitive technology threaten an entire world? But Johnson was not bluffing. After exactly 1 hour, he began the systematic destruction of everything on the planet's surface. Not with advanced weapons, but with simple nuclear devices that your species had possessed for centuries. The alien's breathing became more labored, but his determination to finish his story remained strong. The humans did not just destroy our cities and military installations. They cracked the planet's crust in strategic locations, turning Kethmore into a volcanic wasteland that would remain uninhabitable for thousands of years. Morrison felt sick as he listened to the alien's description. The tactical brilliance of the operation was undeniable, but the human capacity for destruction was terrifying even to him. Johnson's final transmission to the Vorthak High Command was broadcast on all frequencies throughout the Empire, Zethkar said, his voice growing weaker. He said that Kethmore was a demonstration of what would happen to every Vorthak world if the assault on Earth proceeded. He promised that humanity would turn the entire galaxy into a graveyard before they would accept defeat. The alien's eyes began to close, but he forced them open one final time. The Emperor called an emergency session of the High Command. For the first time in Vorthak history, our leaders voted to abandon a military campaign not because of tactical defeat, but because victory would have destroyed our entire civilization. Amy noticed that the alien's vital signs were becoming critical, but she could see that he was determined to deliver his final warning. His breathing was shallow, but steady as he continued. We withdrew from human space not because we could not win, but because winning would have been meaningless, Zethkar whispered. Your Admiral Johnson had taught us that humans do not simply fight wars. They perfect them until victory becomes indistinguishable from mutual destruction. The alien's voice grew quieter as his life ebbed away. When our surrender was negotiated, Johnson could have demanded tribute, territory, or technological secrets. Instead, he made only one request. He wanted to meet with Vorthak military leaders to discuss what he called the future of galactic warfare. Morrison leaned closer, sensing that the alien was reaching the end of his testimony. What did he tell your leaders? He asked quietly. He said that humanity had learned something important from our conflict, Zethkar replied, his voice barely audible. That the galaxy was full of species who might threaten Earth, and that humans needed to be prepared for all of them. He offered to protect other worlds from future conflicts, but only if they accepted human leadership in military matters. The alien's breathing grew more shallow, but his eyes remained focused on Morrison. Johnson was not satisfied with defeating the Vorthak Empire. He wanted to prevent any future wars by making humanity the galaxy's ultimate military force. He saw our conflict not as an ending, but as training for greater challenges ahead. Amy watched the alien's vital signs flatline and then spike again, as if he was forcing his body to continue functioning through sheer willpower. What was his final message to your people? Morrison asked. He told our leaders that they had made a crucial mistake, Zethkar whispered, his voice growing fainter with each word. They had assumed that because humans were young and primitive, they would be easy to defeat. But Johnson explained that humanity's greatest strength was not their technology or numbers. It was their understanding that war is not about individual battles, but about the willingness to sacrifice everything for ultimate victory. The alien's eyes began to close for the final time, but his voice remained clear. Johnson said that any species foolish enough to threaten humanity again would discover that humans had been preparing for galactic warfare for their entire history. Every conflict they had ever fought, every weapon they had ever developed, every tactic they had ever used was practice for the day they would become the galaxy's dominant military force. Zethkar's breathing stopped for a moment, then resumed with great effort. That is my final warning to your species, Commander Morrison. You have become exactly what Johnson promised. The galaxy now fears not your weapons or your technology, but your willingness to perfect warfare until victory becomes inevitable. The alien's eyes closed one final time as his voice faded to nothing. Never underestimate humans in war, because humans never underestimate war itself. With those words, Zethkar of the Vorthic Empire died, leaving behind a recording that would change humanity's understanding of their role in the galaxy. Outside the medical bay, the human fleet continued its patrol of the frontier, now tasked with protecting not just Earth, but dozens of alien species who had learned the lesson that the dying soldier had tried to teach his own people.